The Titanic story isn't as simple as you think. The sinking of the ship is almost always described as a tragedy, a series of unfortunate coincidences and bad circumstances. But what if it was human negligence after all? A little-known fact is that on the night of the disaster, the Titanic received at least 6 separate warnings about icebergs from nearby ships. Some of these messages were delayed or never reached the bridge. One warning from the SS Californian was famously brushed off by a Titanic radio operator with a sharp reply along the lines of, "Shut up, I'm busy, I'm working Cape Race," as he was overwhelmed sending passenger messages. And the warnings weren't the only problem. Let's try to uncover the reasons behind this tragedy, taking into account all the facts, both the widely accepted ones and those that were long kept hidden. A fierce rivalry was unfolding between two giants of transatlantic shipping. Cunard Line had already launched the ultra-fast and luxurious liners Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star Line chose not to compete in speed, but instead to focus on size, comfort, and luxury. The idea was simple, yet ambitious: to create the largest and most luxurious passenger ships in the world, ships that would surpass their competitors in comfort. This is how the project of the 3 Olympic-class liners was born: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. The vision behind the Titanic belonged to 2 powerful men: J. Bruce Ismay, the head of the White Star Line, and Lord Peary, the owner of the Harland and Wolff shipyard. The ship was built in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Massive slipways and gigantic cranes were constructed from scratch, as the vessel was so enormous that the entire infrastructure of the yard had to be redesigned to accommodate it. Construction began on March 31st, 1909. Nearly 3 years passed between the laying of the keel and Titanic's first voyage. The cost of the ship was around £1.5 million at the time, an astronomical sum for the early 20th century. Completed in 1912, the Titanic was built to be the largest and most magnificent ship of its time. It was designed not merely as a means of transport, but as a floating palace, a symbol of modern luxury with no equal on the oceans. No other passenger liner offered such a combination of size, comfort, and prestige. Inside, the ship resembled a grand hotel. First-class passengers enjoyed lavish private cabins, elegant suites, and richly decorated lounges. There were dining saloons inspired by European palaces, a French-style cafe, and menus created by renowned chefs, offering multi-course meals worthy of the finest restaurants on land. The ship featured a swimming pool, a gymnasium with the latest exercise equipment, Turkish baths, and even squash courts, amenities unheard of at sea at the time. Among the passengers were some of the most powerful and influential figures of the era. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men on the planet, was traveling with his young wife. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, was also on board, continuing his personal tradition of joining the maiden voyages of his company's great liners. Thomas Andrews was present as well. He had overseen every detail of the Titanic's construction and joined the voyage to observe the ship's performance at sea. Titanic sailed under the command of Captain Edward John Smith. At 62 years old, Smith was one of the most experienced and respected captains of his generation. He had commanded 17 ships before Titanic and was widely regarded as one of the highest-paid captains in Europe. This voyage was intended to be his final crossing before a dignified retirement. Like many of his contemporaries, Captain Smith believed that modern shipbuilding had reached a level where a vessel like Titanic was effectively unsinkable. In his view, the advances of engineering had rendered the oceans powerless against such a ship. It was a belief shared by an entire era. Among the first-class passengers was also Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was not born into aristocracy. Her husband made his fortune in the gold and silver mines of Colorado. By the standards of the early 20th century, the Browns became multimillionaires. Isidore and Ida Strauss were traveling aboard the Titanic in first class. They were originally from Germany, and built their lives in the United States. Isidore Straus became a co-owner of Macy's in New York, a business that placed the family among the wealthiest of their era. Some people had purchased tickets for the Titanic, but changed their plans at the last moment and never boarded the ship. One of them was J.P. Morgan, the American financier and owner of the White Star Line, who canceled his voyage shortly before departure and remained in Europe. Another was Milton S. Hershey, the founder of the Hershey Chocolate Company, who also changed his plans and did not sail. By chance, both men avoided the disaster that awaited the ship. But to understand the Titanic more fully, it's important to look beyond first class. Let's also talk about the third-class passengers and the cabins where they stayed. Most of them were immigrants, heading to America, hoping to start a new life. A third-class ticket cost about £7 in 1912, which was around $35 at the time. Today, that would be roughly the equivalent of about $1,000. For many families, this was a huge amount of money, and some of them had saved for years just to afford the journey. The third-class cabins were located on the lower decks of the ship, mostly toward the front and rear. These cabins were simple, but practical. Most of them were designed for 2 to 6 passengers, with bunk beds, basic furniture, and simple wooden interiors. The floors were covered with linoleum, and the rooms were lit with electric lights. While the cabins were not luxurious, they were actually quite comfortable for their time. In fact, many ships during that era required third-class passengers to bring their own food and bedding. The Titanic, however, provided both. Meals were included in the ticket price, and third-class passengers even had their own large dining room. The food was simple but filling. Breakfast could include oatmeal with milk, bread with butter, bacon, and tea or coffee. Dinner often included dishes like rabbit pie, baked potatoes, bread with butter, and tea. After Titanic left its last port of Queenstown, and set course across the Atlantic Ocean toward New York City, the first ice warnings began to arrive on board. Other ships reported icebergs and ice fields along the route. Some of these messages were received by the wireless operators and passed on to the officers on the bridge. However, overall these warnings were treated rather calmly and were not given much importance. 2 wireless operators were working on board, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. They were busy transmitting private messages from passengers to shore stations. When another ship tried to send an additional ice warning, the operator responded sharply and asked not to be interrupted because he was busy. At that time, the ocean was extremely calm. The surface of the water looked almost like glass. There were no waves that could reveal the outlines of icebergs. The liner continued moving at about 21 to 22 knots, which is roughly 39 to 41 kilometers per hour, almost at full speed. During the night, 2 lookout sailors were watching the dark ocean from the nest at the bow of the Titanic. The sea was extremely calm, and nothing unusual could be seen. Suddenly, one of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet, noticed a dark shape in the distance. At first, it was difficult to understand what it was, but as he looked more carefully, the outline became clearer. It was an iceberg. Fleet immediately rang the warning bell and called the bridge. The officer on duty was William Murdoch. The order was given almost instantly. The engines were ordered to stop, and the helm was turned in an attempt to avoid the iceberg. Whether this decision was the best possible one is still debated today. Some historians believe that if the ship had hit the iceberg head-on, the damage might have been less severe. But in those few seconds, the crew had very little time to react. Moments later, Titanic struck the iceberg. The collision was not a massive crash. Instead, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, opening a series of holes in the hull. 6 watertight compartments were damaged. Titanic had been designed to stay afloat if up to 4 compartments were flooded, but not 6. Another factor may also have made the damage worse. Later investigations suggested that some of the iron rivets used in the ship's hull were not of the best quality and may have failed under the pressure of the impact. Within minutes, water began to enter the ship. After the collision, the ship's turbines slowly came to a stop. The sudden silence was noticeable, especially in the lower parts of the ship. Passengers in third class were among the first to realize that something was wrong. Water had already begun entering the lower compartments. In the corridors and cabins, icy seawater was rising quickly. In some places, it was already knee-deep. People woke up confused and frightened, trying to understand what was happening. At the same time, there was a huge difference between the experience of third-class and first-class passengers. While the lower decks were already flooding, many first-class passengers simply stepped outside onto the upper deck to see what had happened. Everything still seemed calm. The night was quiet, and the ship's musicians continued to play music on the upper deck. Chief Naval Architect Thomas Andrews walked quickly toward Captain Edward Smith. Holding the ship's blueprints, Andrews had already inspected the damage. Water was pouring into the forward compartments far faster than anyone had hoped. After studying the plans, Captain Smith realized the horrifying truth. Titanic had no more than about 2.5 hours left before she would disappear beneath the Atlantic. The ship's fate was sealed. Crew members began asking passengers to put on life jackets and board the lifeboats. Women and children first, they repeated again and again. As the minutes passed, the boat continued to sink deeper into the water. The stern slowly began to rise. Only then did the atmosphere begin to change. People realized this was no drill. Evacuation finally began. But there was another devastating problem. The first lifeboats left the ship half empty. Officers feared lowering overloaded boats into the water, while many passengers still believed it was safer to remain aboard Titanic than to leave her. Every empty seat would later become a heartbreaking reminder of the lives that could have been saved. As Titanic continued slipping beneath the icy Atlantic, time was running out. And for more than 1,500 people still trapped on board, there would be no escape. Not far from the scene of the disaster was the passenger liner Carpathia. At the moment it received Titanic's distress signal, it was about 58 nautical miles, roughly 107 kilometers, away. At the time, that was an enormous distance. Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, had just finished his shift and was preparing to go to bed. Before turning in for the night, however, he decided to make one final radio check. That decision would change history. Suddenly he picked up Titanic's desperate SOS calls. Without wasting a second, Cottam rushed to Captain Arthur Rostron's cabin to report the emergency. Rostron immediately understood the scale of the disaster. He ordered the ship to change course at once and head straight for Titanic's last reported position. The engine room was instructed to push the ship to its absolute limit. To squeeze every bit of power from the engines, the captain even ordered the heating and hot water throughout the ship to be shut off, so that all available steam could be diverted to propulsion. Carpathia was not a fast ship. Yet that night, thanks to the extraordinary efforts of her crew, she reached nearly 17 knots. Even so, it wasn't enough. Everyone on board knew that covering almost 60 nautical miles would take hours. Captain Rostron realized they would almost certainly arrive only around dawn. Despite that, he prepared for the survivors. Crew members cleared passenger cabins, gathered blankets, and began preparing hot tea, coffee, soup, and food for the people they hoped to rescue from the freezing Atlantic. Meanwhile, chaos had taken over aboard Titanic. Technically, an evacuation was underway, but in reality, no one had ever been prepared for a disaster on this scale. At approximately 2:18 a.m., Titanic's hull could no longer withstand the enormous stress. The ship broke apart in two. The bow disappeared beneath the ocean almost immediately, while the stern rose high into the air for several terrifying minutes.